All right, this is the second screencast of the class. Here we're going to cover developmental risk factors in children. So when we discuss criminal behavior, it kind of makes sense to go back to the start. Actually, clinically, most of my experience has been, like therapy experience has been, with kids with delinquency problems, and it's a population that I've really enjoyed working with. To be honest, I think some of the reasons are that some of the behavior reminds me of myself in my childhood, which we won't go into detail about. But to some degree, childhood is characterized by behavior problems. And if you've ever been around like a 3-year-old, basically they're like a little psychopath. They have zero empathy. If they want a toy, they'll run over to another kid and slug them and take the toy, and frankly, they don't really care. They are just self-serving, and it's kind of funny to see. But it's important to look at that behavior. Again, to some degree, it's normal, but on the other hand, it can become pathological, and you can see a lot of this behavior developing in childhood. So let's start. This is, again, origins of criminal behavior, developmental risk factors. First thing that we want to differentiate between is risk factors and protective factors. So what are these? And really, I mean, the book goes into a couple of different areas, but when we talk about biological risk factors, we are looking at a very specific subset. We could look at social or psychological risk factors as well. And it's not typically that one of these things is going to cause criminal behavior. What it is that it's correlated with criminal behavior. So I'll go into that a little more. You can have a number of risk factors and a number of protective factors. And the idea is that if you have enough risk factors, they might combine together and ultimately be causative of criminal behavior. So, we'll look at risk factors versus protective factors. All right, this chapter goes into social risk factors. I do want to make a note here that you should always read the book. The book goes into detail. The book provides you with the literature review. Will give you all of the references for the material. In these screencasts, I just want to cover this and really, add to the quality of the class by trying to include a lecture. So we'll talk about poverty, peer rejection, association with antisocial peers, and school and supervision issues. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is poverty, and this is really kind of difficult to address because there are so many people in this country that live below the poverty line. I mean, we're looking at like 15 million kids in the United States that live in poverty. And the idea that poverty will make you become a criminal is ridiculous. However, through research, what we can do is we can look at correlates of criminal behavior. We could look at non-violent criminal behavior or violent criminal behavior. And we can look at groups, one that grew up in poverty and one that did not. And then the statistical technique, I mean, the basic one that you're using is like a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, or R. If you don't know what that is, you should have learned that in your stats class, but Google that. So correlation coefficient, or R, has a range of -1 to 1. -1 being a perfect negative correlation, 1 being a perfect positive correlation, and 0 being no correlation. So you can look at poverty and criminal behavior, see if there's a correlation, and then you look at the difference between the groups to see if it's statistically significant. And there are significant correlations between poverty and future criminal behavior. But again, I want to use a lot of caution as I go into that and reference a book for more details on that. The next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about, let me go back for a second. Peer rejection. So, peer rejection. What causes peer rejection? I mean, if you had to think a little bit, honestly, when I saw this picture, I couldn't remember what the picture was about. But was it about the kid on the right or the kid on the left? And peer rejection might come from both. The kid's behavior on the right, he looks aggressive and maybe he's threatening the kid on the left. That could easily cause peer rejection. But the kid's behavior on the left might also cause peer rejection. Maybe he's a shy kid or he's really withdrawn. Regardless of what it is, being rejected by your peers has a strong correlation with the development of future criminal behavior. So here's a kid that's withdrawn. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's causing the peer rejection. Now, association with antisocial peers. Now, this is obviously an extreme example. This is a MS-13 gang, like out of El Salvador, but it's a very prominent street gang in the United States. And maybe you grew up in a neighborhood that has gang activity. Well, being associated with antisocial peers is a risk factor for future criminal behavior. But what is it? Is it that everyone is susceptible to this? That if you just hang out with people that are antisocial, that you'll pick up on their behaviors and you will then become antisocial yourself? That's one theory. Or is it that you're antisocial to begin with and that you hang out with like people? That's another theory. Or is it that you might have those pre-existing traits, you hook up with people that are antisocial, and then it exacerbates those traits within you? That's kind of the predominant view in the field right now. Now, I also want to talk about school failure. Now, this is really interesting, and again, like tons of people fail a grade, and they're not criminals. But again, there is this correlation between early school failure. So if you're held back in a grade, I want you to think about this just from a common sense perspective. There's a stigma to being held back, and it might impact you later in the future. Now, what about some other scenarios? Like I have a little brother that wasn't held back, but my parents waited a year to enroll him in school. You might be familiar with the author Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote a book called Outliers. It's really an interesting book if you want some extracurricular reading. But in Outliers, he talks about how people that entered school when they're older actually experience more success. So if you go in and you are chronologically older, developmentally, you'll be higher than your classmates, whether we're talking cognitively or physically or socially, what have you. If you enter school late, there is not a correlation with future criminal behavior or delinquency later in childhood. If you are held back, there is. So there's something about that experience that's really negative. But there could be a lot of confounding variables that cause people to fail school. Obvious example that I can think of, and we'll talk about this later, would be language development. I've worked a lot with kids that are having behavior problems in school. One thing that I've seen clinically is if a child has a language delay, oftentimes they have behavioral problems. So maybe it's that. So there's a third variable, a confounding variable. But think more about that. All right. Now, if we look at poor quality childcare in early childhood, this is also correlated with the development of future delinquent behavior or antisocial behavior as an adult. And the reality is that if you're lucky enough to grow up in a two-parent household, frequently you're going to have both parents working because they need the income to support themselves. I mean, this is relatively new in the United States, but what that means is that kids frequently have to go for childcare or daycare. And unfortunately, the child daycare is not very good in the United States. I mean, there's some great facilities, there's some horrific facilities, but on the whole, they're not really that good. And I'm sorry if I offend anyone, but we can do better for our kids. When you have that poor quality child care, you open up the risk for all sorts of other problems like language development delays, cognitive development delays, and lower ratings of social and emotional development. So that's not good. You want a good quality environment for child's development. What about after school care? Well, there's a whole group of kids that were called latchkey kids. Latchkey kids would come home after school. They just let themselves in and just hang out at home. And then their parents would come home for work after 5 o'clock or whatever it is. I mean, my brother and I did that when we were kids. But there's something interesting about that, and that's the lack of supervision. And supervision is very important to child development, and that's good quality supervision. So lack of supervision is an important factor. We talked about the school failure already. Reading achievement is also correlated with being held back and early school failure. So if you have reading delays, that can also be a factor. Now, parental and family risk factors are also very interesting. And again, there are so many kids that grow up in terrible families and they never become criminals. These are just correlates of criminal behavior that have been identified in the research. And, again, like more research needs to be done in these areas. They're important questions to address and to ask. So the question of the broken home, I mean, this was said to be like the leading risk factor, the leading cause of criminal behavior. Is that really true? Again, people can tell you what they think, and that's it. That's just their opinion. What's really important is the empirical evidence. What does it show? And a broken home isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, look at this little girl there with the parents fighting like crazy. One of the most difficult things that I've done as a therapist is family therapy. I mean, it is so hard. Imagine you get in a room and you have two parents that are fighting with each other in front of their children, and you're trying to get a family to work together. It's really difficult. Frankly, I don't really like to do it, but it can be very, very helpful. That said, I had a boss that would always tell me this, and at first I kind of cringed when I heard it, but this is not necessarily a bad idea. A good divorce is better than a bad marriage. So you have parents fighting with each other, and it leads to an unstable environment for the children. There's lots of other things that can affect this, but I want to address that. Now, an important thing is parenting styles, and you'll need to know these. When something's important, oftentimes I'll put it in red like this, just so you know. And these are 4 general parenting styles. You've probably come across this material in other classes. So you have the authoritarian, the permissive, the authoritative, and the neglecting parenting styles. The authoritarian parent is like the parent that controls every aspect of the child's life. They are all over them. They're like a cop that follows their parents around, or follows their children around to make sure that they're behaving appropriately and they're doing the things that the parents want them to do. A permissive parent, on the other hand, doesn't really control their parents, and there's very few restrictions in the child's life. The authoritative parent is very rational, and they apply reasonable restrictions to their child. and they're usually pretty responsive parents. And then the neglecting parent displays a detached parenting style and is really not engaged in the child's life at all. Now, all of these kind of have their risk factors, except for the authoritative parenting style. That's kind of a protective factor. Now let's talk about two other parenting styles here, enmeshed and lax. And clinically, I've seen these all the time. So the enmeshed parents are fascinating to watch. Maybe you've had an enmeshed parent. But when they come in and they have their children with them, it's unbelievable. They see like every little thing that the kid does wrong and they point it out. So all these minor behaviors are seen as problematic, and they often get blown out of proportion. And then they'll threaten really harsh punishments, but they're really inconsistent in the use of punishments, and the way that they punish is really ineffective. So when they interact with their children, they'll identify some problem behavior, like, you're talking too loud. And they'll confront their child, and usually their child confronts them back, and it escalates the interaction, and it really screws with the family dynamic. So that's kind of interesting to know. The lax parent is the opposite. They don't recognize any problematic or antisocial behavior at all. And this is fascinating to see as well. So you'll have a kid that's just a little terror, and the parents see no wrong in that child. It's like the behavior is occurring right in front of their face, and they just ignore it. So they don't believe that their children's behavior is deviant or problematic at all. There's a good example of a lax parent. I know you've seen this in a restaurant. Like the kids will be running around just acting like fools, and the parents just sit there and smile. Now, even if you have a parent that displays one of these risk factors in parenting style, there's lots of things that can come in and counter that. If you have a really good teacher or a coach potentially, or relationships with other family members that have a good relationship with the child, that can be a protective factor. That's one of my favorite coaches right there, Tom Izzo from Michigan State. All right, now, parental monitoring. We talked about supervision, and parental monitoring needs to be done in like the correct way. You don't need to be that authoritarian parent that spies on their children and puts internet blocks on and monitors the children's behavior and searches through their room. That's probably not a good idea. What that teaches a kid to do is to be sneaky and figure out a way around that. But appropriate parental monitoring and involvement in children's lives is very important. So supervision, good idea, protective factor. Now the influence of siblings, this is really interesting. I like this photo here. And look at that little kid. Where did he pick that up on the left? Siblings are very important in shaping the behavior of their other siblings. Now, in this field, what has really been identified is an older sibling, especially if the older sibling is close in age. And if that older sibling displays antisocial behavior or deviant behavior, that's problematic, especially if the older child has a good relationship with the younger child. If they don't get along, then it can be the opposite. It can have a protective effect, and the younger child won't act that way at all. Now, I want to pause here for a second because I've been using the word antisocial, and I need to make sure that you understand what that means. That doesn't mean like shy, like I don't want to go out and socialize. What antisocial means is that it's violating social norms. So behavior that violates social norms, like the kid on the left, this is a little antisocial. This, very social. Now, parental pathology can also be correlated with future criminal behavior. And I don't want to go too much into detail with this, but depression, alcoholism, and domestic violence can have an impact on the development of later criminal behavior. There's also, so we went through social risk factors, psychological risk factors. One is a lack of empathy. You'll see that later in the course as kind of the hallmark of antisocial behavior. So that's the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Empathy develops in childhood. It's like a developmental step. So young children don't have empathy. They can't do that. When your child goes over and steals a candy bar from another kid, and it's a little kid, like a 3-year-old, and you say, well, how would you feel if Billy did that to you? They don't understand that because they lack empathy. So some children don't develop empathy, and that can be very problematic. We've talked about cognitive and language deficits a little bit, mostly language deficits. I mean, you show me a kid that has a language deficit, I'll show you a kid that has a behavior problem. Clinically, I like to think of this as if you're not very good at using your words to navigate the social world, it's a lot easier to be physical. And sometimes that physical nature is problematic, and it could be bullying, something like that. So think about how all these things can be related. Now, cognitive development, this is another little sticky area. So here, in general, we'd be talking about IQ. There's lots of other cognitive factors as well. But if we talk about IQ, there's some research that suggests that people that have a lower IQ have higher rates of criminal behavior. And if we look at the criminal justice system, we have a good, solid percentage of people that are incarcerated in the United States that are mentally retarded. I mean, it's like, estimates are like 4 to 5% of the incarcerated population in the United States has an IQ below 70. So what is it? I mean, I don't know. There needs to be more research in this area. What I always think is that people that have a higher IQ are less likely to get caught. And then other cognitive factors like attention or impulsivity. Like, people that are impulsive are more likely to get caught. If you're not impulsive, you're less likely to get caught. So you might not be included in the research. All right, now, ADHD is very interesting. And ADHD is one of my areas of expertise. I did my dissertation on ADHD. And I love ADHD. Clinically, I've worked with kids with ADHD and have done ADHD assessments for years. So this is a disorder that is near and dear to my heart. Now, what I want you to do is look up the DSM criteria for ADHD. How are you going to do that? Well, use your friend Google. So Google DSM-4, like the Roman numeral, IV, and then TR, and then ADHD criteria or something like that. Look it up. Get the full criteria. If for some reason you don't know what the DSM is, you better Google that too. All right, so let's talk about ADHD just clinically, and you can see how it'll relate to criminal behavior. I won't go into the specifics with diagnostic criteria. So when someone is ADHD, what is that clinical picture like? All right, I like to divide it up into these 4 areas. And these are on a continuum. I know my check marks and X's here aren't very good, but I do those by hand. So let's take each one. Internal stimulus. What is internal stimulus? Those are those thoughts that are in your head, or the images that pop into your head. I'll bet you, all of you in the class have experienced this. You're sitting down, you're reading your textbook, your lovely Bartle and Bartle, 9th edition, criminal behavior, a psychological approach. You read about 2 pages, And then you look up and you realize that you were thinking about something totally different. Maybe you were thinking about where you were going to go this weekend, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or what you want to have for dinner. But those internal thoughts popped up and you had trouble filtering them out. So this right here is really indicative of the filter for internal stimulus. Some people are not very good at tuning that out. Some people are very good. They can sit in a library and read and read and read and read. External stimulus is stuff that's going on outside of your head. So what's the filter like for that? Some little kids, they'll sit in a classroom and they hear and see everything that's going on. They'll be sitting in their desk and they'll hear a pencil drop and they'll be like, oh, what was that? And then a toilet will flush down the hallway and they'll hear that. And then they'll see a bird move, and then they'll see one of their friends squirming around, and they get up and they look at that. Other kids can tune out external stimulus all day long. So there's other kids that, like, the bell will ring in class and they'll still be doing their work and they don't notice the other kids get up and walk out. They're excellent at tuning out external stimulus over here. Now the need to move and the need to talk is really interesting. And the interesting thing is that movement actually increases attention. So if you have a kid that has an attention problem and they move around, that increases attention. It's with the reticular activating system in the brain. So there's a lot of kids that squirm around in their seats. They fidget. They get up at inappropriate times. They tap their hands like crazy. So there's other kids that can inhibit the need to move and the need to talk. And they'll just sit there, they'll sit still, they'll do their work. The other kids over here that can't inhibit that, they're up and down out of their seat, they're talking inappropriately in class. Now RAF and RFA, this is one of my favorite ones. RAF stands for Ready, Aim, Fire. And what that's really about is your behavioral responses to stimuli. So something happens, and how do you react? Like a kid bumps into you in the hallway. How do you respond to that? Well, you can think about all your behavioral choices, think about the best one, and respond that way. Or, over here, ready, fire, aim, somebody bumps into you, you react right away without thinking about your behavioral choices. That's impulsivity. And what happens then? This is like aiming at your target and deliberately pulling the trigger. Over here is seeing the target, shooting, and then trying to aim afterwards. So when you're all the way over here, think about this. First, think about school. What would school be like for somebody whose behavior is all the way over here? Most of us will be right in the middle on these things. Some of you will probably be over here. That's why you're really good at school. What would it be like to be over here? School would be miserable. You are not built for school. Over here, these students are. Now, over here, these people, if I got lost in the woods and I needed help surviving, I would want somebody like this. I wouldn't want somebody like this to be with me. If I owned a company and I needed people to work for me, I would try and find people like this because they're going to get their work done. Over here, like this level of impulsivity, oftentimes we call those like the hunters, and over here, the gatherers. Or the adventurers and the explorers over here. And over here, gatherers, systematizers, and organizers. Very different profile. If you look in the prisons and the jails, you're going to see an overrepresentation of this. Now, if you throw language skills in there, and you have poor language skills on top of all this, major risk factor. But if you have good language skills, let's say your IQ is pretty high, and you get yourself into trouble, you can probably talk yourself out of trouble. So it's really interesting if you look at ADHD and the links to criminal behavior. And I know ADHD is so common. And most kids with ADHD do not become criminals. A lot of times what we really have to worry about is future substance abuse issues, which in itself is criminal behavior. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is conduct disorder. So conduct disorder is a DSM diagnostic category. And conduct disorder is a prerequisite for future antisocial personality disorder. And we'll talk about that later in the class. But conduct disorder is for kids. I should note here, and it's not in the screencast, but you should also look up oppositional defiant disorder. So look up the criteria for conduct disorder. We're going to go through that in just a second. And look up oppositional defiant disorder, because that's very interesting. Oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder are frequently found comorbidly, like occurring at the same time as ADHD. So conduct disorder is a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms or rules are violated, as manifested by 3 or more of the following criteria. And when we look at these criteria, this is the stuff that you've probably heard of. When you see like those pictures of the serial killers in that first screencast, I know you have those ideas of, oh, that person probably bullied other kids or was mean to animals or started fires. So why do people talk about those behaviors? And this is really it. Conduct disorder, again, is like the prerequisite to antisocial personality disorder. And we'll go well into detail about that. But for conduct disorder, you have to meet 3 or more of the following. So aggression to people or animals, bullying, threatening, or intimidating others, initiating fights, using weapons to cause harm, has been physically cruel to people, physically cruel to animals, has stolen while confronting a victim, or has forced someone into sexual activity. Destruction of property, so has deliberately engaged in fire setting with the intention of causing serious damage, has deliberately destroyed others' properties other than by fire setting, so like graffiti or breaking windows or bashing mailboxes. That's a good example of that. Breaking windows out in cars. Here's a good picture. I actually found a graffiti picture with fire setting at the same time. I thought that was pretty exciting. Deceitfulness or theft, has broken into someone else's house, building, or car. Often lies to obtain goods or favors or to avoid obligation, like conning others. Has stolen items of non-trivial value without confronting a victim, like shoplifting. Stealing some sunglasses there. Serious violation of rules, like staying out at night despite parental prohibitions, like a curfew beginning before the age of 13. Has run away from home or overnight at least twice while living in a parental or surrogate home. Is truant from school beginning before the age of 13. And there's a picture of a runaway. The disturbance in behavior causes clinically significant impairment in social or academic functioning. And if the individual is 18 years or older, the criteria are not met for antisocial personality disorder. But that last one there, this is typically a disorder that is diagnosed just in childhood. So this is a childhood adolescent disorder. After 18, you're going to be looking at antisocial personality disorder. Again, there's lots of material in this chapter. Read the book. You could take a whole class in this chapter and really not know everything. And unfortunately, there's some inconsistencies in the research, and far more research could be done in this area. So again, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know.